Welcome to this Paper Connections investigation. Today we examine the first shot of the American Revolution, smugglers, slavers, heroes, and the birth of American liberty. Now I will read the essay's prologue to set the atmosphere for our audio deep dive. Narragansett Bay, after midnight, the 10th of June, 1772. 8 longboats came on through the dark in line abreast, oars bound in cloth, not a light among them and not a word. At their head was Abraham Whipple, a privateersman who had run down 23 French ships in the late war and knew every shoal of this bay in the dark. At one of the oars sat a shipmaster's son of 19 named Benjamin Page. Their quarry lay a musket shot ahead, heeled hard over on a spit of sand where a Providence packet captain running for home with the schooner in chase had decoyed her in over the shallows at a falling tide and watched her go aground. His Majesty's armed schooner Gaspee, 8 guns, the most hated vessel on the water, under Lieutenant William Duddingston of the Royal Navy, who had spent the spring boarding and seizing until the colony's fury at him had quietly become a plan. A hail cracked across the water, and a figure in a white shirt rose at her rail. Whipple stood in the stern sheets and called back to him. "I am the sheriff of the county of Kent. Come for the commander of this vessel, and have him I will, dead or alive." One musket flashed in the dark, and Duddingston went down, shot in the left arm and the groin. The boats closed and ran alongside. The boarders went up over her rail, overpowered the crew, and put them ashore. Then they fired her, and the flames worked down through her decks until they found the powder, and she blew apart in a roar that flung burning timber across the water and lit the whole bay as bright as noon before the dark closed in again. It was the first shot of the American Revolution. Lexington came 3 years later and has worn the name ever since.
That scene you just read out loud, it truly sounds like the climax of a maritime thriller. You have these muffled oars, a midnight ambush, a burning naval vessel, and a royal officer shot on his own deck. Hearing that prologue completely shifts the traditional narrative you and I were likely taught in school.
That is exactly the intended effect of this text. We are usually told the American Revolution started with the Boston Tea Party, or perhaps with farmers standing on a green in Lexington. But what you are going to hear today is an argument that the true genesis of the conflict was violently tied to smuggling, piracy, and the darkest elements of colonial commerce.
We are essentially taking a deep dive into an incredibly complex, morally fraught history to understand how the foundational wealth of this nation was actually built. I believe we need to begin by looking at the specific environment that forged those men sitting in the longboats.
Let us examine the evidence by traveling back 12 years before that night on the water. We need to look at the spring of 1760. You have to understand the exact economic reality of Rhode Island during the 7 Years' War.
What was happening in Rhode Island at that specific time?
A young captain, not even 30 years old, named Abraham Whipple, brought a sloop named the Gamecock home into Narragansett Bay. This was not a peaceful merchant voyage returning with textiles or tea. Whipple was returning from a sanctioned campaign of maritime predation, bringing with him the spoils of 23 French ships.
Wait, hold on a second. Capturing 23 ships in a single cruise forces you to confront what their economy actually looked like. If a modern ship attacked 23 vessels and stole their cargo, international authorities would label them pirates.
You are making a crucial distinction there. The prosperity of this colony and the vast wealth of its most prominent families was forged in what the author calls a school of plunder, but it was entirely protected by law.
What was the exact mechanism that allowed Abraham Whipple to do this openly and actually be celebrated for it when he returned to port?
The mechanism was a single, highly coveted piece of paper known as a letter of marque and reprisal. This document was issued directly in the name of the British Crown. It legally licensed a privately owned, privately armed vessel to hunt the merchant ships of the enemy during times of war.
I see how that works on paper. They essentially get a permission slip to attack the king's enemies.
That is precisely it. The crew of the privateer would run down their target, board the vessel with armed force, seize the cargo, and take possession of the hull itself. They would then sail that captured vessel into a colonial port and present it before an admiralty court.
And what happens in the admiralty court? Does a judge just hand over the stolen goods?
Essentially, yes. A judge would review the capture, ensure the victim was indeed a legal enemy of the crown, and formally pronounce the vessel a lawful prize. After that legal rubber stamp, the proceeds were divided by a strict contract between the wealthy merchants who funded the initial voyage, the captain who led the chase, and the crew who boarded the enemy's ship.
The naval histories that celebrate these founders often use a very specific phrase for this practice. They call it legalized piracy. You have a structure where stealing from another ship on the open ocean is normally a hanging offense.
You would literally be executed for it under normal circumstances.
But if you purchase the correct permit from the king, and you make sure to pay the proper bureaucratic cuts through the local courts, suddenly that exact same act of violence makes you a colonial hero. You return home rich and legally protected.
That is an excellent way to frame it. You can almost compare this system to a state-sanctioned mafia. These men were foundational patriots, but their daily reality was mastering the art of the shakedown.
They learned their seamanship by hiding their guns until they were alongside a target. They staked their entire existence on their ability to take what belonged to someone else by force.
Those brutal lessons shaped the men who became the foremost citizens of their colony. Esek Hopkins, the veteran commander under whom Abraham Whipple first learned his trade, built his own fortune during the same war using these exact methods.
But the men on the water were only half of the equation, were they not? Somebody had to pay for the ships and the cannons.
You are completely correct. Behind every privateer captain stood the wealthy merchants who fitted out the ships and fed the crews. In Providence, the paramount merchants orchestrating this entire maritime network were the Browns.
Their wealth grew from an Atlantic trade system where the boundary between commerce and predation was intentionally blurred. The historian Sven Beckert uses a precise term for this economic model.
He calls it war capitalism. This was not an economy based on free markets or voluntary contracts. This immense wealth arose directly from the ship and the gun. It was built on armed seizure, colonial privilege, monopoly, and force.
If they're generating all this capital through state-sanctioned violence against the French and the Spanish, how did they sustain that wealth during peacetime?
That is the critical question. When official wars ended, the merchants simply shifted their operations from privateering to aggressive smuggling. The Browns traded with the French and Spanish Caribbean islands for molasses, operating in open defiance of the Crown's customs laws.
They smuggled relentlessly in times of peace just to avoid paying British taxes.
Exactly. And during times of war, they even used prisoner exchanges as a thin legal cover to continue trading with the enemy. The wealth generated by this school of plunder flowed directly from the docks into the creation of vast terrestrial fortunes in Providence.
They used their maritime profits to fund massive infrastructure projects, building distilleries, candleworks, and iron furnaces. They vertically integrated their operations to capture profit at every possible stage.
And that capital generated through smuggling and legalized violence ultimately funded their expansion into the darkest and most horrifying of all Atlantic economies. We need to transition now into the family trade.
You were talking about the transatlantic slave trade. The integration of all those different businesses points toward a terrifyingly efficient supply chain.
It was incredibly systematic. The center of the Providence economy was managed by four brothers, Nicholas, Joseph, John, and Moses Brown. They operated a vast web of interconnected enterprises, taking the head matter of whales and boiling it into high-quality spermaceti candles.
They also ran a rope walk to outfit ships, a sugar house, a chocolate mill, and two massive distilleries that converted their smuggled Caribbean molasses into high-proof rum.
In the year 1764, which happens to be the exact same year they helped found the college that today bears their name, those four brothers joined their capital together to enter the transatlantic slave trade. They fitted out a brigantine named the Sally.
They loaded her hold with the produce of their own manufacturing, packing her with flour, onions, their signature candles, and more than 17,000 gallons of New England rum. Who did they trust to manage an investment of that massive scale?
They placed the brig Sally under the command of Esek Hopkins. This is the very same privateer who had hunted French ships in the previous war.
For 9 months, Esek Hopkins anchored the Sally off the western coast of Africa, systematically trading the brothers' rum and candles for human beings.
The chilling aspect of this voyage is found directly in his surviving account books. He entered every single purchase of a captive human into the ruled columns of his ledger, using the exact same steady handwriting he would use to record a barrel of molasses.
By the time Hopkins finally departed the African coast for the West Indies, he had purchased 196 men, women, and children. We need to examine the reality of those numbers.
Treating people as cargo on a ledger is a psychological detachment that is hard to fathom. The numbers recorded in Hopkins' ledgers detail an absolute catastrophe of human suffering.
What actually happened to those 196 people during the Middle Passage under the command of a former privateer?
Out of those 196 captive human beings, at least 109 did not survive the voyage across the Atlantic. They died of rampant disease in the suffocating hold, or they died of hunger.
Some captives took their own lives just to escape the unimaginable horror of the ship.
And some were violently killed by the crew. Hopkins recorded in his ledger that the captives had risen against them in a desperate bid for freedom. He noted, with cold economic detachment, that he had been obliged to fire down into them and destroy 8 people.
He documented more than 100 deaths simply as strokes of ink, recording them as lost assets. That level of human devastation is difficult to even process.
It becomes even more disturbing when you look at the written orders the Brown brothers gave Hopkins before he departed. They ordered him to sell his cargo for hard cash in the West Indies, but they included a highly specific personal request.
What did they ask for?
They ordered him to bring back to Providence, for the family's own personal use, 4 likely young slaves, boys of 15 or under.
The reality of those instructions is deeply unsettling. They viewed children as custom orders, treating 15-year-old boys as luxury items to be requested alongside a shipment of flour.
The sheer callousness of ordering human beings for personal use while financing the broader destruction of hundreds of lives is staggering.
How did a family process a voyage with that level of human devastation? Did it change how they view their business at all?
The voyage of the Sally actually lost the brothers money due to the massive mortality rate of the captives. But the moral fallout triggered a profound, permanent fracture within the Brown family itself.
Moses Brown, the youngest brother known for his deep reading, experienced a profound moral awakening. Following the tragic death of his wife in 1773, he began worshiping with the Quakers.
On the 10th of November of that year, Moses Brown gathered the people he personally held in bondage into a single room. He read a legal deed aloud that set every one of them free.
He then dedicated the remainder of his extraordinarily long life to the abolitionist cause, eventually founding the first anti-slavery society in the colony. But his older brother, John Brown, chose a very different path.
John remained fiercely committed to the slave trade. He defended the trade publicly as lawful and argued it was economically necessary for the survival of the port.
He continued to actively profit from buying and selling human beings long after the newly formed American Republic had passed federal laws outlawing the practice.
You have 2 brothers sitting at the same dinner table, existing in completely opposing moral universes. One brother is financing abolitionist pamphlets, and the other brother is vigorously defending his inherent right to buy and sell human lives.
Yet they both grew up in the exact same environment, building their initial fortunes using the exact same trade networks.
The divergence between the brothers eventually culminated in a historic legal confrontation. In 1797, John Brown achieved a dark historical distinction. He became the very first man brought to trial under federal law for participating in the transatlantic slave trade.
And the person who helped gather the evidence and bring the weight of the federal courts down upon him was his own brother, Moses.
The disconnect in John's mind was so profound that he actually wrote a letter to Moses during the ordeal, asking him to quietly settle the affair out of court.
He treated it as though they were merely discussing a disputed shipping contract for a load of rum, rather than a federal prosecution for human trafficking. That detail perfectly illustrates how deeply normalized this structure of wealth was in their society.
The Brown family had built a colossal empire through privateering, smuggling, and human bondage. They were the undisputed lords of their local economy.
And this very same family, determined to protect their wealth and their unhindered control of the bay, was about to clash violently with the British Crown. We need to look at the spark that ignited this conflict.
How did the global authority of the Royal Navy finally collide with the local authority of the Providence merchants? The collision occurred over a single vessel sent to police their waters.
In February of 1772, His Majesty's armed schooner Gaspee arrived in Narragansett Bay.
She carried 8 guns and was commanded by Lieutenant William Duddingston of the Royal Navy. The Crown had deployed the Gaspee for one specific punitive reason.
Rhode Island had been officially judged by the British Customs Service to be the most incorrigible smuggling colony in all of British America.
The royal authorities in London recognized that the immense, untaxed wealth of the local merchant houses was built upon a blatant, systemic disregard for the king's revenue laws.
Lieutenant Duddingston was a hard, aggressive officer who despised the colonial smugglers. He carried out his orders with a zealous, uncompromising intensity.
He stopped and searched vessels moving up and down the bay. He detained ships that had already been cleared by local customs officials, and he seized anything he personally deemed contraband.
His actions must have felt like a foreign occupation to the locals. He was single-handedly threatening the entire economic foundation of the colony.
When you have a local economy where everyone from the dock worker to the wealthiest merchant depends on smuggling, an aggressive enforcer is going to create immediate friction.
What was the specific event that escalated Duddingston's patrols from a nuisance into a full-blown crisis?
The flashpoint occurred very early in his deployment, on the 17th of February. Lieutenant Duddingston stopped a local sloop named the Fortune.
He rigorously searched the vessel and discovered 12 hogsheads of undeclared rum hidden aboard. Following his orders, he seized the entire cargo.
This particular cargo belonged to the Green family of Warwick, a highly influential mercantile family. One of the partners in their firm was a young ironmaster named Nathaniel Greene.
That is the man who would soon become one of the most important generals in the Continental Army. Seizing valuable rum from a family of that stature was inherently dangerous in Rhode Island.
But Duddingston made a critical procedural error regarding what he did with the seized goods. This error escalated the situation from a standard customs dispute into a fundamental constitutional crisis.
What exactly did he do wrong? If he found undeclared rum, does the law not give him the right to confiscate it?
We must understand the unique, highly independent legal status of Rhode Island to grasp why his next action mattered so deeply. Rhode Island was not governed like Massachusetts or Virginia.
Under a royal charter granted by King Charles II in 1663, the colony operated almost as an independent republic. The colonists elected their own governor and their own colonial assembly.
They appointed their own local judges. There was no royal governor sent from London to dictate their laws or veto their legislation.
Under the explicit written terms of that founding charter, any maritime seizure made within the colony's waters had to be adjudicated before an admiralty court located physically within Rhode Island.
Lieutenant Duddingston bypassed this requirement entirely. Knowing that a local Rhode Island judge would inevitably find a loophole to return the rum to the Green family, Duddingston sent the seized sloop and its cargo directly to Boston to be tried in a more compliant royal court.
To put that in perspective for you, imagine a highly zealous security guard hired from out of town to patrol a tight-knit neighborhood.
He arrives in a community where everyone's livelihood depends on bending a specific set of rules, and all the local authorities are essentially in on the scheme.
Instead of working with the local police chief and the local judges, this security guard decides to bypass local law enforcement completely. He acts as his own judge and jury, confiscating property and sending the evidence to a completely different jurisdiction hours away.
He is entirely oblivious to the fact that his actions are bypassing the foundational laws the town relies on to protect itself. That kind of overreach would cause an absolute uproar.
How did the local Rhode Island government respond to Duddingston ignoring their charter?
The response was an immediate, aggressive legal standoff. Stephen Hopkins, the Chief Justice of the Rhode Island Superior Court, issued a formal, binding legal opinion.
You should note that Chief Justice Hopkins was also the same man who had built the massive iron furnace in partnership with the Brown brothers. He declared that Lieutenant Duddingston's seizures were strictly illegal because they violated the colonial charter.
Chief Justice Hopkins stated publicly that Duddingston himself could rightfully be arrested by local sheriffs for his actions on the bay.
The response from the Royal Navy Command was absolute and uncompromising. Rear Admiral John Montague, who commanded the King's ships from his headquarters in Boston, sent a furious, threatening letter directly to the Rhode Island governor.
Montague warned that if the people of Newport or Providence attempted to outfit an armed vessel to rescue their seized ships, he would treat them as common pirates. He explicitly threatened to hang them from the yardarm.
The lines were completely drawn.
Yeah.
You have the Royal Navy promising the gallows for local merchants trying to defend their chartered trade routes.
And you have the colonial Chief Justice promising arrest warrants for naval officers who are simply trying to enforce the king's taxes. The entire bay was a powder keg waiting for a spark.
Duddingston's aggressive tactics provided the smugglers with the absolute perfect excuse to strike. They could now plan an assault acting under the noble guise of defending their constitutional liberties, rather than just admitting they were protecting their profit margins.
How did they finally trap him? The moment arrived on the 9th of June, 1772. The tension on the water finally broke.
On that morning, a packet boat named the Hannah was sailing up the bay toward Providence. She was commanded by Captain Benjamin Lindsay, a seasoned mariner who had spent years navigating these exact, treacherous waters for John Brown's mercantile operations.
The Gaspee spotted the Hannah and immediately gave chase. Lieutenant Duddingston signaled for Lindsay to heave to for a search.
When Lindsay brazenly refused the order, the Gaspee fired warning shots over the Hannah's deck. But Captain Lindsay did not panic, and he did not flee toward the deep water of the open ocean.
He knew the local geography intimately, far better than the British lieutenant. He deliberately steered his sloop toward the shallow waters off Namquid Point.
He knew exactly what the tides were doing at that specific hour. Lindsay drew the heavier, deeper draft British schooner across a hidden spit of sand.
The lighter Hannah sailed cleanly over the submerged sandbar. The heavier Gaspee drove hard into the sand and ground to a sudden, violent halt.
The timing of the tides meant the Gaspee was completely trapped. Once a ship that heavy hits a sandbar on a falling tide, it is entirely helpless.
The water recedes and the schooner rolls onto her side, unable to bring her cannons to bear. She would be stuck there until the high tide returned at 3 o'clock the following morning.
Captain Lindsay essentially orchestrated a masterful naval trap without firing a single shot. Once the Gaspee was stranded, Lindsay sailed onward to Providence. Where did he take the news of this stranded royal vessel?
He delivered the news straight to John Brown's counting house on the Providence waterfront. This was the exact opportunity the merchants had been waiting for all spring.
That evening, a drum beat through the streets of Providence, calling the men to gather. They assembled at the Sabin Tavern.
Inside the tavern kitchen, they actively melted lead and cast musket bullets. After dark, the men moved down to the docks and filled 8 longboats.
The entire expedition was commanded by Abraham Whipple, the veteran privateer who had captured 23 ships in the previous war. And sitting right beside him in the boats, directing the operation, was John Brown himself.
We need to be absolutely precise about the historical facts of this night raid, because the conditions dictate how we understand their mindset. This is a vital point to fact-check.
This was June of 1772. This is the summer. The water they rode across in the dark was not freezing. They were not fighting off hypothermia. They were executing a calculated, temperate nighttime assault.
They wrapped the oars and the tholes in cloth to completely muffle the sound of their approach against the water. They rowed in a disciplined line down the western shore, fighting the current in absolute silence.
As they approached the stranded schooner in the dark, they executed a highly specific naval maneuver. The boat shifted from a single line into a coordinated formation, advancing abreast toward the target.
That detail is crucial for you to understand. This was not the chaotic, unpredictable behavior of a drunken mob stumbling out of a tavern. This was a highly organized, tactical military strike executed by experienced masters of vessels and coordinated by wealthy merchants.
When they finally closed the distance to the stranded ship, the sentry on the Gaspee spotted the approaching shadows and called out the alarm.
Lieutenant Dodingston rushed up to the deck wearing his white shirt. He demanded to know who was approaching his ship in the dark.
According to the prologue you read, Abraham Whipple stood up in his longboat and shouted across the dark water. He announced himself as the sheriff of Kent County.
He declared he had come to arrest the commander of the vessel and that he would have him dead or alive. It is a brilliant piece of psychological warfare, using the Chief Justice's threat of arrest to justify boarding a Royal Navy ship.
What happened the moment Whipple issued that threat?
Before another word could be spoken between the commanders, a young man named Joseph Buckland raised a musket from one of the longboats. He fired the very first shot.
The musket ball struck Lieutenant Dodingston in the left arm and the groin. The British commander collapsed onto his own deck, bleeding profusely.
With the commander down, the men from Providence swarmed up the sides of the schooner. They utilized the boarding tactics they had mastered during their privateering days and easily overpowered the stunned British crew.
They tied the British sailors up, secured them, and rowed them safely ashore. In a profound stroke of historical irony, one of the raiders in the longboats was a young man with medical training named Dr. John Money.
After the crew was subdued, Dr. Money knelt beside the bleeding lieutenant on the deck, ripped his own shirt into bandages, and carefully dressed the severe wound that his own companion had just inflicted.
Once the crew was removed from the vessel and the wounded commander was treated, the raiders systematically searched the ship. They were not looking for plunder.
They were looking specifically for Dodingston's written orders, seeking the official documentation of the authority he claimed to possess. After stripping the ship of its official papers, they set the Gaspee on fire.
The flames consumed the wooden hull, eating their way downward through the decks until they reached the powder magazine.
The explosion shattered the absolute silence of the bay, sending burning debris high into the night sky. The flames illuminated a crime that the British Crown simply could not ignore.
This was an undeniable act of high treason. The local merchants had just destroyed a commissioned vessel of the Royal Navy and shot a king's officer.
The dual nature of this event is undeniable, and it forms the core paradox of their revolution. The men in the boats viewed their actions as a righteous, necessary defense of their chartered constitutional liberties against a tyrannical, overreaching officer.
But they were simultaneously executing a violent strike to defend the illegal smuggling profits that sustained their massive fortunes. You cannot separate the patriotism from the profit.
The explosion of the Gaspee triggered an immediate and massive cover-up by the entire colony. This localized conspiracy leads directly to what historians call the Wall of Silence.
How did the colonial government respond the morning after a royal vessel was blown to pieces in their own waters? They could not simply pretend it did not happen.
There was wreckage burning in the bay and a wounded British officer recovering on shore. The official response from the colonial government was a masterpiece of political theater.
Governor Joseph Wanton, who was elected to his office by the very same wealthy merchants who had just burned the ship, issued a formal public proclamation.
He offered a reward of £100 for the discovery of the perpetrators. He commanded all local sheriffs and officers to diligently seek them out.
It was an entirely useless, performative gesture. The entire community, from the tavern keepers to the dock workers, knew exactly who had led the raid.
The reward was offered to a population that had absolutely no intention of ever claiming it. It simply allowed the Rhode Island government to send documentation to London claiming they were diligently performing their duties,
while purposely doing nothing at all to advance the investigation. But London was not going to let a local governor sweep the destruction of a naval vessel under the rug.
When news of the burning finally reached the British government, the Crown's response was designed to be terrifying. King George III personally issued a royal proclamation.
The Crown bypassed the local government entirely and offered a massive life-changing reward of £1,000 to anyone who would name the ringleaders of the attack.
They offered a full and free pardon to any raider who turned King's evidence against his commanders. And most importantly, the king decreed that any suspects arrested for the crime would not be tried by a local sympathetic jury in Rhode Island.
They would be chained, loaded onto a ship, and transported across the Atlantic Ocean to stand trial for their lives in England. That specific threat changed the entire calculus of the event.
It was no longer just a dispute over rum taxes. It was a fundamental threat to the legal rights of every colonist. The Crown established a powerful Royal Commission of Inquiry and sent them directly to Newport to find the guilty men.
The commissioners arrived expecting to break the locals easily. They assumed the combination of a massive financial reward and the horrific threat of the gallows would produce witnesses immediately.
But instead, they collided with a complete and total wall of silence. No one spoke. No one claimed the money. Consider the analogy of omerta, the infamous mafia code of silence.
The silence in Rhode Island was built on the exact same foundation of deep kinship, intertwined marriages, and mutual financial interest.
The leading families were all related by blood or business. Abraham Whipple had married into the Hopkins family. Stephen Hopkins, the Chief Justice of the colony, used his massive political and legal power to ensure the royal inquiry failed before it even began.
He publicly stated from the bench that he would refuse to hand over any Rhode Islander to be transported beyond the sea, regardless of what evidence the royal commissioners discovered.
He signaled to the entire colony that the local courts would protect them from the king. But despite the familial bonds and the legal threats, there was one major breach in this wall of silence.
One person did actually come forward to claim the reward and tell the truth. Who broke the code of silence?
His name was Aaron Briggs. He was a young indentured servant of mixed African and native descent. He worked on a farm on Providence Island, right in the middle of the bay.
Aaron Briggs stepped forward, managed to reach a British vessel, and gave a sworn, detailed confession to the naval officers.
He admitted he had been ordered into one of the longboats that night, and he explicitly named John Brown as one of the primary leaders of the raid.
This testimony was incredibly dangerous. It had the potential to unravel the entire conspiracy, provide the royal commissioners with the evidence they needed, and send the richest men in the colony to the executioner's block in London.
The Royal Navy officers knew Briggs would be murdered if he remained on land. They took him aboard one of the king's ships, anchored in the harbor to keep him alive and secure him as their star witness.
The response from the Rhode Island elite must have been swift. They have the wealth of the colony on the line, and their lives are literally hanging on the testimony of an indentured servant.
How did they neutralize Briggs without attacking the Royal Navy ship he was hiding on? They turned the local legal system into a weapon against the Crown.
They did not need to attack the ship. They used paperwork. Local magistrates swore out an arrest warrant against the British naval captain who was protecting Briggs.
They threatened to arrest the British officer on severe charges of kidnapping, claiming he was holding an indentured servant against his master's will.
Simultaneously, the local merchants gathered a massive array of sworn affidavits from their associates and employees. These documents swore under oath that Briggs had never left Prudence Island on the night of the attack.
They produced witnesses who swore he was a known pathological liar. They flooded the Royal Commission with so much contradictory paperwork that they completely destroyed his credibility as a witness.
They used the colonial law itself to shut down the king's inquiry. They sacrificed the one completely powerless man who actually dared to tell the truth.
They protected their wealth, their smuggling operations, and their own lives by entirely crushing Aaron Briggs under the weight of fabricated affidavits. The Royal Commission sat in Newport for months, examining the conflicting evidence, and ultimately disbanded without naming a single suspect.
The wall of silence held firm. But the story of what happened could not stay contained within Narragansett Bay. The rest of the American colonies needed to hear about the king's extreme threat.
The threat of being transported across the ocean for a trial without a jury of your peers struck fear into the hearts of colonists from Boston to Williamsburg.
How did the rest of the colonies even find out about this? If Rhode Island was completely stonewalling the king, did the story just stay local?
A burned schooner in Rhode Island only became a national grievance because of a highly organized, powerful communication network, and that specific network was built and managed by Benjamin Franklin.
Long before the shooting war of the Revolution began, Franklin had recognized the immense strategic power of the printing press. He understood that whoever controlled the distribution of words could control the public mind of the colonies.
He established strategic partnerships with printers in major cities throughout the colonies. Furthermore, as the Deputy Postmaster General for North America, he controlled the very roads, riders, and routes along which information traveled.
In Providence, the man controlling the local press was John Carter. Carter was the publisher of the widely read Providence Gazette.
He had served his printing apprenticeship directly under Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia, learning the trade from the master. And crucially, Carter also held the position of Providence's first postmaster, an appointment given to him directly by Franklin himself.
The man who printed the news and the man who delivered the mail were the exact same person. That network mobilized immediately to shape the narrative of the Gaspee.
The newly formed committees of correspondence, which were essentially shadow governments coordinating communication between the colonies, took the story of the burning ship and completely transformed it.
They carefully and deliberately stripped away all the uncomfortable context. They did not mention the smuggled rum, they did not mention the illegal trade networks, or the fortunes built on avoiding taxes.
They framed the entire incident purely as a tyrannical, unprovoked attack by the Crown on the fundamental liberties of Englishmen. They focused entirely on the king's threat of removing citizens from their homes for trial across the sea.
They printed inflammatory pamphlets describing the Royal Commission in Newport as a court of inquisition, designed to strip Americans of their right to a fair trial.
It forces you to ask a very uncomfortable historical question. Was this the glorious birth of the free press defending democratic principles? Or was this the first major instance in American history of manufacturing public outrage?
Were they utilizing sophisticated political propaganda merely to protect the financial interests of a wealthy smuggling elite?
Regardless of their initial motivations, their propaganda campaign was undeniably successful. They successfully convinced the other colonies that an attack on the wealthy smugglers of Rhode Island was an attack on the fundamental liberty of all Americans.
This manufactured outrage unified the fragmented colonies, preparing them psychologically for the coming war. And when the fighting finally began at Lexington 3 years later, the smugglers of Rhode Island were forced to radically upgrade their operations.
They transitioned from pulling muffled longboats in the dark to commanding armed warships on the open ocean. This evolution marks the birth of the smugglers' navy.
When the war officially broke out in the spring of 1775, the American colonies faced a massive logistical nightmare. They were going to war against the British Empire, which possessed the most powerful maritime force on Earth.
And the colonies did not possess a single national warship of their own. How did they bridge that gap? Who actually built the first ships to fight the Royal Navy?
The task of building a naval force fell immediately to the merchants of Rhode Island, who already possessed the ships, the cannons, and the experienced crews.
The State Assembly voted to fit out 2 armed vessels to protect their coastal waters from British reprisal. The very first ship they formally commissioned into service was a merchant sloop named the Katy.
This sloop had been built, owned, and operated for years by John Brown. They armed her with small cannons and placed her under the command of Abraham Whipple, the exact same man who had led the illegal raid on the Gaspee.
The Katy became the flagship of the first state navy in America. Shortly after her commissioning, the Continental Congress formally acquired this little vessel into national service. They renamed her the Providence.
Therefore, one of the very first warships of the newly formed United States Navy was a smuggler sloop, built by the wealthy merchant who had helped ignite the conflict and commanded by the man who had ordered the first shot.
The connections between the criminal operations of the past and the patriotic operations of the present run even deeper. When the Continental Congress realized they needed to appoint a commander-in-chief for this new national navy, they looked to Rhode Island again.
Who did they select to lead the entire fleet?
They selected Isaac Hopkins. This is the very same man who had commanded the slave ship Sally for the Brown brothers 11 years earlier, the man who had recorded the deaths of over 100 captives in his ledger.
He owed his prestigious appointment largely to the political influence of his brother, Stephen Hopkins, the former Chief Justice who now served on the Naval Committee in the Continental Congress.
Under Isaac Hopkins' command, the small, newly formed American squadron sailed south to the Bahamas in early 1776. They executed a daring amphibious assault on the island of Nassau to capture British gunpowder for George Washington's army.
This operation was the very first amphibious landing in the history of the United States Marines, and the men who stormed the beaches were carried ashore by the Providence, the ship that used to be John Brown's Katy.
The irony embedded in the founding of the Navy is simply staggering. The first United States Navy was entirely reliant on the ships, the captains, and the tactical experience forged in the fires of smuggling and the transatlantic slave trade.
The very men who burned the king's ship for personal profit were now commanding the nation's ships for national liberty. However, the official Continental Navy remained incredibly small, chronically underfunded, and often trapped in port by larger British squadrons.
The actual devastating economic damage inflicted upon the British Empire was achieved by the colonists returning to the very roots of their wealth, the private war.
The real impactful maritime conflict of the American Revolution was not fought by the official Continental Navy, it was fought by privateers.
These were privately owned, privately armed vessels licensed by the individual states and the Congress to attack British merchant shipping, utilizing the exact same letters of marque system they had used during the 7 Years' War.
During the course of the Revolution, more than 2,000 American privateers were commissioned. They swarmed the Atlantic. They captured hundreds of valuable British merchantmen.
They brought home desperate supplies of gunpowder, muskets, and heavy cloth that the starving Continental Army desperately required to survive the winters.
They inflicted far more catastrophic economic damage on the British Empire than the official Navy ever could. The profits from this privateering were enormous for the owners and the crews.
In fact, it paid so well that it actively bled the official Continental Navy of recruits. Why would a sailor choose to fight on a privateer rather than a national warship?
If they are fighting for the same cause against the same enemy, what drives them away from the official Navy?
The motivation was purely financial. Sailors flatly refused to endure the harsh, rigid discipline and the notoriously low, often delayed pay of the national service when they could sign aboard a privateer and earn a substantial share of massive captured prizes.
Commanders like Isaac Hopkins and John Paul Jones constantly complained to Congress that they could not man their official warships because all the able sailors in the ports had gone privateering.
The private pursuit of wealth, the very mechanism that built the colony's initial prosperity, was actively starving the official navy the colony had founded.
There's one specific privateer voyage from this era that captures the deepest, most horrifying contradiction of the entire war.
In the winter of 1777, a heavily armed 20-gun privateer brig named the Marlborough sailed from Providence. The Marlborough was owned by John Brown. She was commanded by Captain George Waite Babcock.
Her destination was not the shipping lanes of the Caribbean or the coast of England. Her destination was the western coast of Africa.
The Marlborough sailed to Africa specifically to attack the British slave trade. They violently raided British slave trading factories on the coast, and they captured British slave ships as prizes of war.
We must make this explicitly clear to understand the absolute moral failure of this moment. The crew of the Marlborough did not attack these British ships to free the enslaved people trapped inside them.
They did not liberate them. They took the enslaved human beings as prizes of war. They seamlessly merged their patriotic, armed fight for American independence with the plundering of human beings for personal profit.
They fought a war for human liberty, sailing under a flag proclaiming freedom while actively capturing and selling enslaved people. This contradiction is impossible to ignore.
And while the privateers roamed the distant oceans seeking profit, the brutal reality of the war came violently back to the very waters where the Gaspee had burned. We must examine the battle for the bay.
In December of 1776, the devastating reality of the war arrived directly on the doorstep of the Providence merchants. A massive British invasion force, consisting of roughly 6,000 regular troops and Hessian mercenaries, occupied Newport, located at the strategic mouth of Narragansett Bay.
Newport was the fourth largest town in America at the time, and its deep, protected harbor provided the Royal Navy with a perfect, impregnable base to enforce a strict blockade of the entire region.
They essentially locked the door to the bay. They trapped the American privateers in port, strangling the local economy. They anchored rotting prison ships in the harbor to hold captured American sailors in horrific conditions.
With the mouth of the bay entirely controlled by the enemy, the town of Providence further up the river was transformed into a fortified, desperate arsenal.
The Brown family's massive iron furnace shifted production entirely to casting heavy cannons to defend the river approaches.
The war that the merchants had actively started to protect their unhindered freedom of trade had now become a desperate, existential fight for the survival of their own homes and their own bay.
The Americans could not allow the British to hold such a massive strategic base right in the middle of New England. In the summer of 1778, the Americans launched a massive joint operation to retake Newport and break the blockade.
They were supported by a powerful French naval fleet commanded by the Comte d'Estaing. On land, General John Sullivan marched 10,000 American troops onto Aquidneck Island to lay siege to the British defenses.
It looked like they were going to crush the British garrison. What went wrong with the siege?
Before the trap could fully close on the British forces, a massive, violent hurricane struck the New England coast. The devastating storm severely damaged the French fleet, dismasting several warships and forcing the French admiral to withdraw his entirely battered fleet to Boston for extensive repairs.
General Sullivan was suddenly left completely isolated on Aquidneck Island without any naval support to prevent British reinforcements from arriving.
Recognizing his vulnerable position, Sullivan was forced to execute a rapid tactical retreat northward across the island to escape total destruction.
On August 29, 1778, the British and their Hessian mercenaries aggressively attacked the retreating American lines, forcing a massive confrontation. This became known as the Battle of Rhode Island.
The specific mechanics of who fought in this battle hold a profound significance for understanding the era. Earlier that year, struggling desperately to find enough able-bodied men to fill its troop quotas for the Continental Army, the Rhode Island Assembly passed a radical, unprecedented legislative act.
They officially allowed enslaved men to enlist in the military. The act explicitly promised that any enslaved man who passed muster and joined the ranks would be absolutely free.
The colonial government promised to eventually compensate the enslavers for the loss of their property using funds from the public treasury. These enlisted men were formed into the 1st Rhode Island Regiment.
During the brutal combat of the Battle of Rhode Island, this specific regiment, comprised of newly freed black and native men, held the critical right flank of the American defensive line.
They withstood repeated, ferocious, bayonet-led assaults by the highly trained Hessian troops. They absolutely refused to break under heavy fire.
General Sullivan officially commended their extreme bravery, noting that they saved the entire army from being outflanked.
The brutally profound irony of this moment demands your full attention. A colony whose entire immense fortune was built upon the ruthless exploitation of the transatlantic slave trade was now entirely relying on enslaved men, offering them freedom as a desperate transaction in order to win a war for national liberty.
I ask you to sit with the crushing reality of what happened to these soldiers next. These men fought, bled, and died for a republic that had previously enslaved them.
The casualty rates were horrific.
Right.
More than half of the soldiers in that regiment died during the course of the war. They died of terrible wounds on the battlefield. They died of rampant disease in freezing camps.
And for those who actually survived the brutal conflict, the promise of freedom was eventually given, but they received absolutely nothing more.
While white veterans routinely received valuable land grants and steady pensions for their service, the surviving black soldiers of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment were turned out of the Army with nothing.
They were left to starve in the streets of the nation they had bled to create. They did not receive military pensions until the year 1818, a full 40 years after they held the line against the Hessians.
To truly grasp the vast scope of this era and to understand how these massive historical events impacted the people who lived through them, we must zoom back into the micro level.
We need to follow the life of one specific individual who lived through all of these massive contradictions, witnessing the birth of the nation from the longboats to the global trade routes. We must look at the rising star of Benjamin Page.
Let us return our focus to the young man who pulled a muffled oar in the dark during the initial raid on the Gaspee. Benjamin Page was exactly 19 years old on the night the schooner burned.
He was born directly into the seagoing world of the Providence waterfront, learning the harsh realities of maritime trade from a young age.
His remarkable trajectory demonstrates the incredible trust placed in capable young men by the merchant elite during this volatile period. In 1774, nearly 2 years after the Gaspee raid, at the remarkably young age of 21, Benjamin Page was given command of a merchant vessel named the Smack.
The powerful Brown family trusted a 21-year-old captain with a ship and a vast sum of their personal money. They sent him across the treacherous winter Atlantic to the coast of Holland.
His specific mission was to quietly purchase cannons, flintlocks, and gunpowder for the impending rebellion. British spies operating in London actually tracked his movements in Europe, recognizing the deadly treasonous intent of his voyage, but he managed to evade them.
He completed the mission successfully and returned to Rhode Island just as the war began. When the fighting officially commenced, he did not stay on the sidelines.
He entered the dangerous naval service and endured its most brutal hardships. He served as a lieutenant aboard the armed sloop Providence, serving directly under Abraham Whipple once again.
He survived the disastrous Penobscot expedition in 1779, a massive naval failure where the American fleet was completely trapped and destroyed by the British, forcing the surviving men to march hundreds of miles home through the freezing wilderness.
He survived the devastating fall of Charleston in 1780. By his own written account, he was taken prisoner by the British military 4 separate times during the war, enduring the horrors of the prison ships, and yet he returned to the fight 4 separate times.
Benjamin Page acts as the connective tissue of this entire era. His life stretches across the full span of the founding of this nation.
After the war finally concluded and independence was secured, Page returned to the maritime service of the Brown family. He commanded their massive merchant ships on the newly opened, highly lucrative trade routes to Canton, China.
He literally carried the flag of the new republic to the far side of the globe, opening markets that the British had previously restricted.
Then, decades later, in January of 1818, at the age of 65, Benjamin Page sat down in his home in Newport to write a letter. He wrote to a close friend who had ascended to the absolute highest echelons of the American legal system. He wrote to Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story.
Page meticulously outlined his long record of service, detailing his 4 captures by the enemy, his wounds, and his financial struggles, and he asked the powerful justice for assistance in securing a federal military pension.
He wrote in the letter, "As this is the Jubilee of the Heroes of 1776, I ask again for your assistance."
Think about the arc of that one man's life. His experiences stretch from pulling muffled oars in the dark water of Narragansett Bay to commit treason, to commanding global trade routes, to eventually appealing to the highest courts of a newly established nation for recognition.
His long life forces us to confront the ultimate reckoning of the nation they built. We must look at how deeply these paradoxes, the blending of liberty and exploitation, are woven into the country.
The great paradox of this entire history is embodied perfectly by Moses Brown. Moses attempted the most difficult, perhaps impossible, moral experiment of the era.
He tried to keep the vast family fortune while simultaneously renouncing the horrific trade that built it. He freed his enslaved people. He funded abolitionist movements. He even prosecuted his own brother under federal law.
But the wealth he used to fund his righteous, noble causes was inherently tainted by its origins in violence and bondage. The very college he helped endow, Brown University, stands physically on ground cleared by the forced labor of enslaved men.
And tragically, even Moses Brown's visionary solution to end slavery ultimately perpetuated it on a much larger scale. Seeking a viable economic alternative to slave labor, Moses financed Samuel Slater's revolutionary cotton mill in Pawtucket in the 1790s.
He deeply believed that free labor manufacturing in the North could prove to the nation that they did not need slavery to generate massive wealth.
But within a single generation, the booming textile industry he helped launch demanded absolutely massive quantities of cheap, raw cotton. That required cotton was grown exclusively by enslaved people on the expanding plantations of the American South.
The free labor mills of the North became inextricably bound to the slave plantations of the South. The wealth of the nation and the wrong of bondage were fused together permanently.
We must confront the intense moral hypocrisy of these men directly. They fought a brutal, bloody war for American liberty, demanding rights and representation, while simultaneously operating as prominent, unapologetic slave traders.
They drafted eloquent declarations of universal freedom while actively calculating the acceptable mortality rate of human cargo in their leather-bound ledgers.
However, to view them solely through the modern lens of their hypocrisy is to miss the profound historical reality of their achievements. You must recognize the monumental existential risks they took.
They risked the gallows to defy a global empire. They forged the first colonial navy out of smuggler sloops. They defeated the greatest military power on earth to establish a fragile republic where citizens could govern themselves without a king.
Their profound flaws make them realistically human, rather than mythological figures in a textbook. Their actions, despite their massive sins, were exceptionally important, monumental steps for achieving American independence.
The liberty they sought for themselves was real. The bondage they perpetuated for others was real. Neither was a disguise for the other. Both truths existed simultaneously in the exact same men.
As we examine the historical record and the bibliography of this era, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to explore on your own. Consider how we teach the origins of the American Revolution in our schools.
The Boston Tea Party occurred in 1773. It was a bloodless protest over corporate tea taxes. Nobody died. No naval ships were burned. Yet it is universally taught as the definitive spark of the revolution.
The burning of the Gaspee occurred a full year earlier in 1772. It was violent. It was bloody. It involved the targeted shooting of a king's officer and the absolute destruction of a royal naval vessel.
It was an undeniable act of high treason that nearly triggered a massive royal crackdown in transportation trials. Yet the Gaspee is largely hidden in the shadows of popular history, relegated to a footnote. Why?
Is it because the Boston Tea Party provides a clean, simple story of liberty resisting taxation? And is it because the story of the Gaspee forces us to look directly at the uncomfortable, undeniable marriage of liberty and slavery?
Does the Gaspee reveal too much about the brutal school of plunder that actually built the wealth of the founding generation? It is a question you must answer for yourself as you consider the true origins of the nation.
To conclude and leave you with the author's reflections, I will read the epilogue. Narragansett Bay, the same dark water. Go back to the boats one last time. The line abreast, the cloth-bound oars, the musket flash, the fire, the bay lit white for a moment before the dark takes it back. Only now you know the men. The privateersman at the head of the boats, who had hunted for profit long before he ever struck a blow for liberty. The merchant beside him, who had sent a ship to the slave coast and would one day stand trial in the republic he helped to found. The boy of 19 at one of the oars who had carried the new nation's flag to the far side of the world. They believed they were striking for freedom, and they were. They were also defending a fortune that freedom and bondage had built together, and no one in the boats that night could have told the two apart.
Thank you for joining us. Stay tuned for our next episode.